Hi everyone, it's Raina. So this video is for those people who have their natal moon in the 8th house. And I've been anticipating this one because this is Scorpio's house in the universal chart. And as I have been doing various planets and signs and even planets, I did the sun in the 8th house already. It generates more interest when there's a Scorpio angle. Why is this? Well, because Scorpio, if you have like an inner planet in Scorpio, or if you have placements in the 8th house, especially personal planets, which will definitely impact your personality or your personal life quite directly, I would say. But we do look at even the outer planets can affect us when we look at the house placement for sure. But, that's those kinds of the sign of Scorpio in personal planets and 8th house placements can indicate that the person has a very strong desire to psychoanalyze or to look beneath the surface and try to uncover the secrets of a person's, basic, core personality traits, their persona in some cases, like Scorpio rising. And that Scorpio or 8th house influence is like the natural psychologist and the natural researcher or investigator, even trying to figure things out, trying to make sense of things from the perspective of emotions, because the 8th house is a water house. So suffice it to say, if your natal moon is in this water house, I don't care if it's in Capricorn. I don't care if it's in something very dry, you know what I mean, like Capricorn or like Aquarius. You're going to have a depth to you, an emotional depth that other people may not even begin to fathom. And this will be especially true if your sun, moon, and or rising is mainly in earth and air, because they will tend to be drier, less emotional, and people may underestimate really how deep, how still waters run deep, I guess I would say. So the moon is our emotional nature, and it's our instincts. I have said that I believe these are connected, and this is one reason not to worship emotions, in my opinion, because we tend to think, oh, wow, I have an emotion, but that's really having conditioning. The more that, the less reactive that you become, the more that you see things in a more impartial way. Because, of course, the emotions are highly, highly subjective. Two people can go through the same set of circumstances and it can generate different emotions in each person. We can't say anything will be a universal, that it will universally affect people in the same way, and they will have the same emotions, even if they're negative emotions. Some people might get angry, some people might get terrified and traumatized, and things like that. So in any case, speaking of trauma, the 8th house can certainly be about trauma. The 8th house is the house of sex, death, and other people's money. That's kind of a cliche, but it works. It works pretty well. But the 8th house, it's shared resources, so it's going to involve, if you're married, your spouse's money. It's going to involve in some cases, if you add death plus money, you get inheritance, right? So inheritances can come up here. In the moon in the 8th house's case, this can be from the mother because the moon is the mother. Before I continue, shout out to astrocodex.com, which I'm staring at right now just to, rather than just taking notes, it's just easier to sit here and have the screen open and then look at some of the things they say and just put it in my own words. And I also got some good information I've been looking at this too. I don't even know how to pronounce it, but it's astrologyk.com. And this may be the first time I've ever looked at that site. I have so many astrology books that it's kind of new in the last few years to even look at websites. But now it's pretty much all that I do, because it's just easier when I'm in front of the computer as it is. So basically, what I want to say about this is, the 8th house can be about control. The two planets that rule Scorpio, the ruler of this house, are Mars and Pluto. And so Mars is the god of war. Pluto is the god of the underworld. So suffice it to say, this isn't a warm and fuzzy kind of an area of life. It's kind of the seedy underbelly of life. And people who have a strong 8th house in terms of like a prominent planet, I have the sun here, and having the moon here can have similar results, although there may be some slight differences. One thing that I think is similar with the sun and moon in the 8th house is an interest in what makes other people tick. This is why I was talking about psychoanalysis, for instance. And, the 8th house can be, the shadow. And so true crime, definitely can be fascinating to somebody who has the moon in the 8th house, where you just are like, why, what makes a person become a serial killer? Or somebody who's a famous criminal, wanting to read about them and, kind of trying to get a handle on what went wrong. How did they become the way that they became? The 8th house is a house of taboos. Now, sex is included in the 8th house. For one reason, sex, it's funny that I said taboo because that can be perceived as a taboo. But the 8th house is also about power issues and trauma. So sometimes sexual abuse can come up here. Although I will say that with the moon in the 8th house, I'm not quite sure that this is indicative in and of itself of sexual abuse of somebody. But I will say that if you have Saturn or Pluto in the 8th, particularly, I'm trying to think of any other planet that might, where it might be. I'd say particularly Saturn and Pluto. In the 8th, I should say Saturn or Pluto, or possibly both. This could, with the moon there, this could indicate somebody who has experienced sexual abuse and as a result has, this has damaged them emotionally, because what will happen is the person will lose trust in others, and that can lead to a lot of problems when they get to be the age of dating. And of course, sometimes sexual violation can occur when somebody's already a teenager, already dating. It's not always like in childhood, obviously, but in any case, definitely we would see, just like with a prominent Scorpio placement, maybe trust issues. And also, it makes me wonder too, like if, since the 8th house, since the moon can be the mother, if perhaps in some cases, the person is dealing with a mother who has these deep, dark secrets surrounding some type of sexual abuse or something along those lines. And the child is having to kind of, sometimes the child, in many different instances, if there's a family secret, for instance, the child acts it out emotionally. They're the ones that kind of act as a receptacle for the emotions, the intense emotions of the family. And they're the emotional one, the emo one, the moon in the 8th house person, because they're very intuitive and able to understand that something is going on, but they don't know quite what it is. Which brings me to the fact that if you have the moon in the 8th house, chances are you're going to be highly intuitive. And it's funny, Codex almost made it sound like, oh yeah, you might have some abilities. I would say you really do. And they also talk about being able to communicate with the dead. Yes, I would call that channeling. And you may have that ability to go into a trance and to talk to those who have crossed over. And, if you have Uranus transing this house, for instance, perhaps it comes very spontaneously when you least expect it that this thing happens. There might be times, in other words, I would say, because I think Uranus may be tied to the Kundalini, so it's like the sexual, not the sexual, believe me, that was not a Freudian slip, the spiritual awakening that is, I think can be associated with Uranus transiting. In the 8th can be maybe these spontaneous trance episodes where you can go in and you can start to communicate with the dearly departed. And there's also, Pluto especially can be associated with healing. So that might be ultimately what your aim is, to help others to heal. For instance, to understand that there is no such thing as death. And so anyway, one of the things with the moon in the 8th house is that, in Codex, Astral Codex mentions this, is about manipulating energy for magical use. That's the exact quote from the website. Now, getting back to sex, I read somewhere that the 8th house is described as sex magic. Or I've also read somewhere where they said spiritual sex. So in other words, any planet that you have in the 8th house, you're going to take the affairs of that house seriously. In the 8th house, you're going to take the affairs of that house seriously. You're not going to be frivolous. And so when you have the moon here, your relationships in general, I'm specifically talking about your romantic relationships, because that's where we tend to give away our hearts the most. But it could probably apply if you're a parent to your child, or something, or even a friendship, is that you love very deeply. There's no gray areas in your love. And they mentioned here more than once overprotective. I'm trying to think if this is, that might have been the other site, because I don't see it here. Well, one of these sites mentioned multiple times about being overprotective, which I would associate more with Cancer than with Scorpio, because I think Scorpio tends to be, pretty, maybe with the Mars energy, pretty brave themselves. And I think they would want to raise their children like that and not coddle them. So, but I do feel that the love nature is incredibly intense. And this means that even if your moon is in Gemini, if it's in the 8th house, you will tend to, maybe even have a heavy type of emotional nature. And it may confound you and frustrate you because you really want that lightness. Gemini does not want to be saddled down with heavy emotions, and yet it's almost like you can't help it. It's going to happen whether you like it or not. And, to give an example of, it also, let's say if you have, I was going to say if you have Scorpio in this house, oh my gosh, this is going to be kind of, really emphasized. And this is one thing about Scorpio and the 8th house and having the moon here, is that you are like, you love deeply, but if somebody doesn't love you back, if they betray you in some way, I think you can get quite cold. And I don't see that here, but I think, I've seen it with the moon in Scorpio. This is like having the moon in Scorpio, to have the moon in the 8th house. And, sometimes people are really lovey-dovey, but then when they don't get their way, when the other person doesn't return their affections, for instance, then they can act, because they are hurt, they can get very vicious. So that's something obviously to temper, to not indulge in, because it can lead to, first of all, alienating other people who don't like that type of attitude and behavior. And that can create rifts in your, relationship. As well as, now, this is interesting because here they say that the feelings can fluctuate and that you are trying to yearn for something more in your relationships. But the thing is that I don't believe that to be the case. I disagree with that. I do think that, the moon is associated with fluctuating emotions, okay? And that means that there can be a tendency to, like, I'm talking about, it can create more change, likelihood of change to have the moon in a certain house. But I think that when it's in a fixed sign, it can make it more stable. And Scorpio is a fixed sign. So I think that's part of the problem, is that Scorpio falls in love and that's all she wrote. They're not going to, even if the other person says, I'm not in love with you anymore, Scorpio might be like, that's nice. So when are we going to get together again? You know what I mean? It's like that obsessive, stalker type of mentality. I'm not saying that you're a stalker. I'm saying that a fixed sign fixates on things. That's an obsession. And the reason something is an obsession is because a person finds it hard to move on. Once they sink their teeth into a relationship, they don't want to move on. I mean, if it's really feeling good to them, they want to keep it. But it's important to consider the other person. You can't just have things your own way because you want them. And this is where imposing one's will on, emotionally on another person can come into play. And one of the things that the Astro Codex mentions is what they call psychic vampirism. Okay, I'm trying to find out where they actually said that. Well, you know what's strange? They said, I'll just read what it said. If the natal moon in the 8th house is in a water sign, the person will have quite a lot of psychic abilities, even being capable of psychic vampirism. In case that the moon is in Scorpio, the native can become a sexual vampire, and with adverse aspects from other planets, he may frequently use such powers in order to absorb the energy of his partners. This can be done unconsciously and seem to the native as a thirst for deep feelings. I would alter that a little bit. First of all, I don't know what they're talking about with sexual vampire. You know, but in terms of energy vampires, yeah, I think that's what they're saying when they say psychic vampire. Energy vampires are people who feed off of other people's emotions in order to feel alive. But that's a common trait of a narcissist, and people have said that narcissists are energy vampires, and that makes sense. But a lot of times these people will try to generate negative emotions in others because it's not the positive emotions that they're feeding off of, it's the negative ones. And so that would mean that some of you might be capable of that, and I'm not sure that that's really what is going on here. I don't think that a moon in the 8th house is necessarily trying to feed off of other people's emotions. I think they just genuinely are empathic, and they do connect at that very deep level with them. Of course, any sign is capable of being an energy vampire, usually due to their own trauma, and their reaction to it is to try to control others, to get other people to be in a low state of vibration, because it's like, that saying, misery loves company. It's like literally true. People who are at a low vibration, they can't stand when somebody is happy. It irritates the living hell out of them. And that's a sign that the person is in a dark place. So being able to understand yourself better emotionally and your motivations is super important if your moon is in the 8th house. And most of you will do this fearlessly. You won't be afraid to kind of, delve into that area of life. It's almost like fascinating to you, because it's almost like that's what I'm here for. But for some signs like Pisces and Libra and Cancer, it may be that you interpret it in a different way. As a matter of fact, I don't know which one of, it's so funny. They mentioned that the moon in 8th signs that tend to get to be in danger of being the victims of a vampire are Pisces, Cancer, and Libra. And I had singled out those 3 signs in my mind for just people who may be, less. It might have actually been for the 7th house that I had done that. But there are certain signs for the moon position that are, even in a very fierce house, like the 8th house, will have a tendency to be more passive. And that's why these 3 signs were cited. But especially in the realm of relationships, because these 3 signs may have a tendency to be much more concerned about, well, how I would put it is, I think that people with the moon in the 8th house are concerned about really connecting at a deep level with a partner. So that is always going to be front and center for your emotional needs. Whereas somebody with the moon in the 7th house may be more concerned of just not being alone and having a partner to begin with. But the 8th house, it's like you're very extreme emotionally. You either feel it or you don't. And anything shallow, anything that doesn't really click is just going to fall by the wayside. It's not going to register in your life. So that's why, there can be exceptions with certain signs, which tend to be more passive, agreeable, and that sort of thing. And, concerned about the other person. So, the one thing I will say, and they touched on this. They touched on those kinds of very dark feelings that the eighth house. I'm trying to think. It must be that other. Let me see if the other one. It's funny how one site will really talk about these things and the other site won't. And let me read from astrologyk.com exactly what I was talking about. The moon in the 8th house can be a symbol for powerful and unconscious complexes existing below the surface of life, and they may have to dig up painful memories from the past. Ordinarily, they express extreme forms of hatred, passion, and jealousy, as well as depression. A, quote, heavy emotional nature is often present, and there may be confrontations of many sorts. Such intensity means that they cannot just skim the surface of life. They often possess a more honest and profound understanding of life than most people do. And this is going to be, I think, in part because it's like the old soul concept, where you've been through a lot. So you're not going to be, this innocent babe in the woods. And so this can make a young moon in the 8th house person wise beyond their years, emotionally savvy beyond their years. Similar to somebody with the moon in the 12th house or any, like in certain planets in the 12th house. However, with the 8th house, because it is Scorpio, I think that there is a tendency to be quite a certain confidence that you would not have if you had the moon in the 7th house. So the ability to kind of, be who you are unapologetically, even if it's, very challenging to others, where they feel that you are coming across in a very, how can I put it, in a way that is much more hard to fathom sometimes, because you may be secretive. I mean, they don't mention this, or I didn't see it. You may be secretive about your own emotions, just like Moon and Scorpio people are. And yet, you may get everybody else to like tell you their life story, to confess all their deep, dark secrets, and you're just sitting there eating popcorn, taking notes, and being completely mum about your own life. And again, what does that mean? That's kind of like a form of power. Having that control over the situation where you're kind of like the person that they're confessing to, like the priest, but you're not returning the favor. You know what I mean? So that's one thing. But, the other thing is that the childhood could have set you up for this intensity. And that's why I say, too, perhaps some kind of issues with trust. The thing that can be quite I don't know if the word disturbing is right, or very upsetting to a person. Let's say your moon is in Libra and it's in the 8th house. This can lead to a lot of projection because Libra wants to be accepted, wants to be approved of, wants there to always be peace and love and harmony, and doesn't want anybody to feel bad. And yet, underneath the surface, a Moon in Libra person is human. And some people may piss the hell out of them. Some people may dislike, but they would never dare say something like that out loud. And just in general, if a Moon in Libra person is in a relationship and they feel upset with their partner for some reason, but they're afraid of making waves, they may have beneath the surface a lot of rage. And that rage ain't going anywhere. And depending upon other factors, how does it seep out? Can it be through sarcasm? Can it, which is passive aggression? All forms of passive aggression. In some cases, the person may, have a tendency to hint, to try to get what they want, but they're afraid of really just coming out and saying how they feel. And yet they have like seething rage, maybe jealousy that is buried beneath them. And sometimes these things do come out in various ways, and other people can tell that the individual is hostile. But there may be great guilt, denial over it in some cases, and that can leave a person fractured, where they really are not owning their shadow. I think that is a great candidate for somebody who may become, disowning their shadow instead of trying to eradicate it through working to bring it to the surface. So I could go on and on about this, but I just wanted to kind of give some insights about what this placement can mean. The truth is it's a very, it can feel very heavy to have this placement. So it's up to the individual to make an effort to always cultivate a sense of positivity in life. Even if you love looking at things from that particular perspective, being able to also embrace the light is so important. And any case, thanks for listening. And if you'd like a private reading, the link to my online store is below. Take care. Bye.